My name is Martin Farr. I'm Chair of Insight's Public Lectures. The level of interest this lecture has aroused, and the number of people here, I think, is a testament both to the seriousness of the subject and also to our speaker in raising it to such a level of prominence. And to introduce her and to chair the lecture this evening is my colleague from English and the chair of the Newcastle University Gender Research Group, Stacey Gillies. Stacey.
Thank you, Martin. I have to say, when Martin emailed me and asked me to chair this lecture, my initial feeling was one of tremendous irritation, and then that rapidly turned to anger. And in short, I was just very unhappy that I was being asked to chair this. This was not, however, that I was being asked to chair this event, but there was a need for this event to take place at all. As someone who came to anger in my teens via the Everyday Sexism Project of its time, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, I came to anger very much about the conditions and representations of girls and women. This anger I felt about this talk is not a particularly novel emotion for me to experience. To borrow a term from the cultural theorist Sara Ahmed, I often find myself in the position, as I'm sure many of you do, of being what is known as the feminist killjoy. It seems to me both mundanely and extraordinarily frustrating that we live in a world in which everyday sexism is so prevalent, but also that the mere mapping of it, as Laura has done, is regularly meant with derision and hostility. In some parts of the world, people have found the possibility of activism against multiple and various forms of injustice, and the capacity, I think, of the web and social media to enable these communities of resistance must be maintained and fought for. And the Everyday Sexism Project is an important part of these communities of resistance. Laura has collected over 80,000 testimonies of gender inequality through this project. She writes regularly for The Independent and The Guardian, and you might have seen her piece earlier this week about the media reaction to a young woman's reporting of a group of wolf-whistling builders for sexual harassment. She was the winner of the Georgina Henry Women in Journalism Award this year and was 9th on Radio 4's Women's Hour Power List. Her book, Everyday Sexism, and she will be available outside, as Martin says, to sign copies afterwards, was shortlisted for the Waterstones Book of the Year and for the Political Book Awards Polemic of the Year. Please join me, I hope in anger and in solidarity, in welcoming Laura to Newcastle and to Newcastle University.
Brilliant. Hello, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Newcastle University, for inviting me. I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed. I don't think I've ever done a talk to 4 rooms full of people at the same time before, so I'm feeling a bit nervous. So hello to everybody and to everybody in the other rooms who I can't see, and thank you so much for coming. I sent a quick text to my sister about half an hour ago when I walked past the queue on the way in saying how nervous I felt that there were so many of you here, and she wrote back and said, don't worry, just imagine everybody in their underwear. And I had to write back and say that actually in my line of work that's really inappropriate, not at all helpful. So I would just try to get my nerves under control in a different way. But it is absolutely amazing to be here, and particularly I think to be here today, the culmination of a week where we have seen so many issues hitting the headlines that are relevant and pertinent to sexism and to what we're talking about tonight. It's a week in which basically really you kind of want to sum up the whole week by just screaming that women are people too, I think. You know, we've seen women standing up and protesting an advert on the tube in London. I don't know how many of you have seen it, the Protein World advert, which sent the message that women in public spaces, if you want to go to the beach, if you want to dare to take your clothes off, if you want to relax, if you choose to wear a bikini, you have to conform to some kind of incredibly unrealistic and narrow media-dictated norm of what it is that your body should look like, the idea that your body is there for other people's judgment. And we saw women standing up to that and saying, actually no, actually if I have a body and I go to the beach, that's my beach body. We've seen a young woman who experienced a sustained campaign of sexual harassment every morning for a month on her way to work, including not only wolf whistles but people catcalling her, inappropriate comments, and somebody physically blocking her path. And eventually, after a month, when she reported it to the police, we've seen this reported in the media as girl calls in police because of a wolf whistle. We've seen people debating whether or not wolf whistles should be made a criminal offence, and isn't this just PC gone mad, which is not something she ever suggested. And it's just incredible, because I think if you look at these things together, what they really suggest is that as a society we are more outraged by the idea of women standing up and saying enough is enough. We are more outraged by the idea of somebody standing up and saying my body belongs to me, more outraged by the idea of a young woman saying, you know what, I don't have to put up with harassment every day on my way to work, than we are about the idea that she faced that harassment in the first place, than we are about the idea that women are being made to feel that way about their bodies in the first place. And I think for me that is so much a part of this kind of tipping point, this realization where you start to see things around us, the things that are normal, the things that we have put up with day after day after day because they seem so small, and because it is so difficult to kind of put them together and to see the whole bigger picture that they create. And really that's what everyday sexism is all about. And it's funny for me because when I started Everyday Sexism, it almost was something that came about by accident. I didn't for one moment imagine when I started it that I'd be here speaking to you today. And in fact, it's really strange to think that about 7 or 8 years ago I was at university and I wasn't particularly aware of the women's movement. I wasn't particularly aware of or involved in feminism, to my great shame. And it's so interesting to look back now and to realise that actually I was at a university where a supervisor in my college wore a black armband every year on the day that women had been admitted to the college. I had a boyfriend who would go off and play football at university, and he came back from the end of year dinner with a trophy he'd won. And I was like, that's great, you won a trophy, what was it for, congratulations? And he was like, no, it's nothing, it's nothing. And I thought that was a bit odd, and I was like, no, come on, what was it, what did you win? And he brought it out, and it was a kind of plinth, a wooden plinth, and then a spray-painted gold plaster cast thing like that on top of it. And it was the Under the Thumb award for the player who spent too much time with his girlfriend during the course of the football season. And I had a dissertation supervisor at university who sent me an email to arrange to meet for our first tutorial, and it said, let's meet at the front gates of the college. I'll bring a red rose, you bring a copy of yesterday's Telegraph. And those are, you know, incidents which kind of stand out above and beyond the catcalling and the hassling and the kind of drip, drip, drip daily stuff. So it's fascinating to me to look back on that and to realise that I didn't connect the dots, and to realise that I accepted it as a normal thing, as part of life, as just the way that things were. And I moved to London and I started working as an actress. And that was really interesting because when you work as an actor, you get these things called casting breakdowns. They come through when you're going up for a particular role, and they tell you a little bit about the part and the kind of actor that they're looking for. So I was living with my boyfriend at the time, and he would also get these casting breakdowns. He was an actor as well. And his would say things like, this character is 24, an architect, quite sensitive, feels things quite deeply, finds it difficult to form close relationships, is quite sort of introverted. These are the things that have happened to him in the past that have made him that way, but he does have a very close relationship with his family. And I would get casting breakdowns that would say things like 32 double D. Nothing else, no other information, nothing about what kind of personality this woman had. Or occasionally they would say things like, she's virginal but she's a vixen. Or she's naive yet fuckable. And it was just genuinely those words sort of juxtaposed. And it was amazing how it was this kind of cartoonish idea of how you build a woman from parts, building blocks of how much men would want to have sex with her, essentially. And I turned up at one audition, and it was an advert audition, which when you're an actor is a kind of holy grail, because you only film for a few days on an advert, but you tend to earn quite a lot of money for it. So it's really good for helping to keep you going while you're looking for other jobs, because you tend to be struggling financially. So I'd worked really hard, I prepared the script, I prepared my lines, I sat in the waiting room for about 15 minutes going over and over and over it in my head. And then I was just about to go into the audition room, and someone came and put their hand on my shoulder and said, oh, by the way, we decided to sex it up a bit and now you're taking your top off. And they didn't say, you know, could you or would you or could we discuss? It was just a complete given. It was completely normal and assumed that that would be fine. But the thing that really got me kind of almost above and beyond that was the fact that in the back of my head there was this small voice kind of going, it's a wardrobe advert. It's an advert to sell a wardrobe. Why do they need a woman with her top off to sell a wardrobe? It's got nothing to do with the wardrobe. And I think that was something that kind of started me thinking a bit more about those kinds of issues. And I was also nannying at the time because I was a terrible actress and was getting absolutely no jobs. So I was making rent by picking kids up from school and taking them home, making them dinner and nannying. And I started to notice that I'd come home from one of these auditions where it had been all about looks and I'd been told to take my top off or whatever. And I'd pick up the kids from school and they were only around 9 or 10. And the boys would be running around playing games and the girls were worrying. And age 9 or 10, they used phrases like thunder thighs. And they worried about what boys were thinking about them. And I remember really vividly I made pasta for dinner for them one night and the girls wouldn't eat it because they'd read somewhere that pasta made you fat. And I started to feel like I was seeing, obviously not sort of completely simplistically, but I was seeing a bit of a cause and effect. Something about this really narrow lens through which women were being seen and portrayed and the impact it was having on these really young girls. But I still kind of didn't quite connect all the dots. And what happened for me was that I just had an absolutely terrible week, exactly 3 years ago, actually, 3 years ago last week, where I was walking home one night after nannying, and it was one of those quite hot evenings where the traffic was moving quite slowly, and as I walked past a car that had its window wound down, a guy just shouted out of the car window and sort of offhand comment, something about my legs. And I just kept walking and ignored it, but then unfortunately the cars were kind of going at the same speed I was walking at, so they were kind of, and the guy in the next car thought it would be really funny to shout something a bit worse, something about what he wanted to do to me, and then the people behind thought it was really hilarious, and they kind of did this one-upmanship. And I put my head down and I just went home, and it felt terrible, but I just put my head down and ignored it, like you do. And then a few nights later, I was on the bus on the way home quite late at night, and I was on the phone to my mum. And I thought the guy next to me accidentally brushed me with his hand and just ignored it and carried on talking to my mum, didn't think anything of it. And then gradually realised that actually, no, he was groping his way up my leg and into my crotch. So I stood up and I moved away from him, and because I was on the phone to my mum, I said out loud what was happening in a way that I think perhaps I wouldn't have done otherwise, because I was in that kind of slight bubble of not being so self-aware. So I said, I'm on the bus, this guy just groped me. And it was quite a small bus, so everybody on the bus heard, and everybody looked out the window. Not one person stepped in to help, but even more than that, there was a very palpable sense of, oh, this is awkward, you know, a sense of kind of almost disgust aimed at me. Why are you bringing this up? A sense of disapproval that made me feel incredibly embarrassed. There was a real sense of just deal with this is your thing as a woman. You're in a public space, don't bring it up. And it made me feel really embarrassed and kind of like I was wearing the wrong thing, maybe I shouldn't have been there, maybe I'd done something to cause it. Basically the feelings of embarrassment and shame and guilt that belonged with the guy touching up random women on the bus. And so that was really interesting, and I went home and again I kind of put my head down and I got on with it. And then a few days later I was walking down the street and there were some guys unloading some scaffolding off the back of a lorry, and as I walked past within a metre of them, one of them turned to the other and just went, look at the tits on that. Not even her, just that. And it was that weird thing again where I was right there. They could tell that I could hear them, and it was just normal. There wasn't any sense of embarrassment from them. There wasn't any sense that I might react or do something, or there might be any kind of consequences. It was just completely normal. And what happened was that at the end of this week, by sheer coincidence, obviously I'd had these things that had happened in such a short space of time that I was thinking about them. I was sat down and I was thinking about this awful, terrible week I'd had. And the thing that hit me was if they hadn't all happened like that in 1 week, I never would have thought twice about any one of those incidents because they were normal. And it made me think back about how many similar things had happened over the years and months at university, in the street, outside university, and temp jobs I'd done, you name it, that had been isolated incidents of the same kind that I'd never mentioned to anyone, that I just accepted because it was part of life and it was part of being a woman. And it made me start to question that and think, why on earth has this become so normal that I wouldn't even react, that I wouldn't even think twice about this stuff happening? And I think that it's really common to have the thought process of maybe it's just me, am I overreacting, am I doing something that's causing it, have I just been unlucky? So I started asking other women, have you ever experienced anything like this? first just people I knew, and then people I'd just met, people at parties, people in the supermarket, older women, younger women, and just saying, have you ever experienced anything like this? And I think I was kind of vaguely thinking that maybe if I asked sort of 50 women, I'd get 10 who had stories. You know, that someone would say, yeah, a few years ago this happened to me. Or it would be someone who would say something like, I once had a job where it was like this. And I thought that maybe I could profile those stories, maybe I could write an article about them or do something to kind of bring it all together. What actually happened took me completely by surprise. It was every woman I spoke to. And it wasn't this thing that happened 3 years ago or once in a job. It was literally, on my way to meet you today, this just happened. Most days this happens. It was a person I met who worked in an office who told me that in her office, her male colleagues would go to a strip club at lunchtime, and that sometimes they'd take clients there, so she would miss out on those deals. I spoke to someone else who worked in an office where when women were coming in to apply for new jobs in the company, they would, the men in the office would print out their pictures from the online application forms and hold them up and rate them out of 10 across the room. And there were stories of women who, you know, not just experienced wolf whistling or catcalling, but being followed, being grabbed, groped, touched, licked, bitten, you name it, in public spaces. Some of the stuff was so much more serious than I think people often think of when they hear the word sexism. But I asked a lot of these women, you know, well, have you done anything? Do you think you could challenge it? Is there something in place if you complained about this workplace situation? And they all said no. And they said, you know, until you actually asked me, I've never told anyone about any of this, because it's just sort of normal, it's the way things are. Or I wouldn't feel able to say anything because I'd be rocking the boat. I'd be a troublemaker. I'd be making a fuss about nothing. It's banter. It's kind of normal. Everyone else puts up with it. It's just the way things are. So I felt like there was this massive thing going on, and that ironically, because so many of us were so used to it, we weren't talking about what was happening, and actually that meant that people didn't realise it was happening. So I started trying to talk about it. I started trying to speak up. And I said, I think this is sexism. I think this is people being treated differently or being discriminated against because of their sex. And I came up against a brick wall. People, and particularly men, said to me, no, there is no such thing as sexism anymore. Women are equal now, more or less. You know, there is no problem. Women have all the same rights in this country. There really isn't sexism anymore. And because of that idea, that kind of social perception that we had achieved gender equality, if you tried to talk about sexism, they said you're making a fuss about nothing, you're overreacting, you're getting your knickers in a twist, you need to learn to take a joke, you need to learn to take a compliment, you need to lighten up. He probably didn't mean it that way. And we were hearing these things so many times. So I felt like perhaps they were right. I didn't know a huge amount about it. It wasn't something I'd ever kind of looked into or been very much aware of. I felt like things did seem relatively equal, and I thought I'd look into that argument that everything was fine and that there was no problem. Oh. Uh-oh. Okay, I don't want to go backwards because then you're going to see them all. Oh no. Is there anybody technical who can help?
I'm just a girl.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Okay, so I started looking into it, and I started with politics, because I thought actually that's an area where it's not just about representation, but also about people making decisions that affect the rest of us on a regular basis. So I looked into politics and found that actually less than a quarter of our MPs are female, that there are more MPs, or there were more MPs in our most recent parliament there were more male MPs sitting then in Parliament than there had ever been female MPs in history. I found out that only around a fifth of our House of Lords is made up of women, and that the UK comes joint 57th in the world for gender equality in political representation. Then I looked into the law, because I thought that's another area where actually people are making decisions that impact on the rest of us regularly. And I was really surprised to find that actually only 7 out of 38 Lord Justices of Appeal and 18 out of 108 High Court judges are women, which is actually quite shockingly low when you think about it, and I reckon most people would guess it was a lot higher. But I also knew that if I went back to those people who told me women are equal now, there's no problem, with these statistics, they would probably say, oh, Laura, there are some areas in which men outnumber women, sure, but there will be other areas where women dominate. You know, perhaps men are more likely to go into politics or law, but there will be other areas that women go into more than men, and so things even out. So I thought I would look into the area that I thought those people would most stereotypically associate with women and with female domination. And I looked into the arts. And I found that actually, at our National Gallery, it was reported in 2010 that out of 2,300 works of art, the collection contained paintings by just 10 women. That it's been over 14 years since a female choreographer was commissioned to create a piece for the main stage at our Royal Opera House, and that out of 573 statues around the UK, listed statues commemorating people of interest and aspiration, only 15% of them are women. And at this stage I kind of kept looking, and it was amazing. It was everywhere I looked. I found that actually fewer than 1 in 10 of our engineers is female, which is less than half the proportion of France or Spain. That our Royal Society, one of our most important scientific institutions, has never had a female president, and only 6% of the current fellowship are women. And that argument that men are more likely to go into certain areas, or that, you know, women just aren't so interested in certain things, just doesn't bear out when you look at the statistics, because actually, for example, women are 50% of chemistry undergraduates, but only 6% of professors. I looked into the media, another area that I thought people might think women were perhaps more likely to go into, and found that actually women only write 1/5 of front-page newspaper articles, and that 84% of those articles are dominated by male subjects or experts. I found that women only direct around 5% of the 250 major films each year, that they only have about 30% of Hollywood speaking roles, but they're about 3 times more likely to have to take off their clothes in those roles than men are. And that while only 1 in 5 UK architects is female, 63% of them report experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace during the course of their career. And then these were the statistics that really got me. I realised that actually on average in England and Wales, over 2 women per week are killed by a current or former partner. There's a phone call to the police every minute about domestic violence, even though only around 40% of cases are ever reported to the police. A woman is raped every 6 or 7 minutes in the UK, adding up to over 85,000 rapes and 400,000 sexual assaults every year. And that a woman today living in the UK has a 1 in 4 chance of becoming a victim of domestic violence, and a 1 in 5 chance of being the victim of a sexual offence. And that worldwide 1 in 3 women on the planet will be raped or beaten in her lifetime. So when you take it all together like that, the argument that women are equal now and there's no problem really doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But I also felt that it was incredibly difficult to set out to solve a problem if people wouldn't acknowledge that that problem existed. I didn't think it would work to go in all guns blazing trying to tackle sexism if we were coming up against people saying it's not an issue, it doesn't exist. So I just really wanted to bridge that gap between the idea that this isn't happening anymore and the reality of what women and girls were telling me they were coming up against on a daily basis. And I really just wanted other people to have that experience I'd had of hearing all those stories together, and it forcing you to recognise what a widespread problem it was, how much more severe it was than people realised, and how when you look at these things all together you start to see the connections between them, and how much more difficult it is then to brush off any one incident as making a fuss about nothing, or you need to get a sense of humour. So the easiest way I could think about to do that was with a website, and I started this website and I asked people to share their experiences of any kind of gender inequality, no matter how large or small. And I didn't have any funding, any way of advertising it or promoting it, so I hoped that maybe 50 or 60 people would add their stories to the website. What actually happened took me completely by surprise. Actually now it's been 3 years since we started the project, and what started as 100 entries quickly turned into 1,000 and then 2,000, and last week on the 3-year anniversary of the project we hit 100,000 entries from people all over the world. They came from people of different backgrounds in different areas of the world, of different races and ethnicities, different gender identities and sexual orientations, disabled and non-disabled, religious and non-religious, employed and unemployed. We heard from a woman in the city who was told to sit on her boss's lap if she wanted her Christmas bonus. A woman working in a video store who found that every time she went up the ladder to get fresh stock from the storeroom, her boss would spank her, and when she came back down he'd look down her top and say, "You know why I hired you." We heard from a vet just out of university who was really passionate about racehorses, but found that there was a particularly prestigious racehorse that she wasn't allowed to touch when she visited because only the male vet was allowed to tend to it. We heard from a reverend in the Church of England who found that there were people constantly just asking if there was a man available to perform the wedding or the funeral ceremony. There was nothing personal. We heard from a man who was congratulated for babysitting his own children. From a 16-year-old girl who said, "I know I'm smart and funny, I know I can do whatever I want, be whatever I want to be. People keep telling me I could be a doctor or a lawyer, But I also know it doesn't really matter what I do, because the only thing that really matters, the only thing that will really determine whether I'm successful is whether or not boys find me sexy and attractive. What if my breasts don't grow? What if my hips don't widen and I don't get a little waist? If those things don't happen, I'll still feel like the fat, ugly girl, no matter what else I achieve in my life. We heard from a 15-year-old boy who was bullied at school because he wanted to take drama GCSE and it was considered too girly for him. We heard from a DJ who said that constant groping and harassment had made her come to dread the job that she'd once loved. And then stories started coming in from other countries, from further afield. Within a few months, we were hearing from women all over the world. We heard from a woman in Argentina who tried to ignore 4 men catcalling her, only to find that when she ignored them, they screeched to a halt and tried to drag her into their car. We heard from a woman in Germany who said that having her crotch and her bum groped was something that happened so frequently, she just described it as the norm. A woman in Mexico who was told by her university professor in a lecture in front of the other students, "Caidita te ves más bonita," you look prettier when you shut up. We heard from a university professor in Ukraine who spoke 6 languages that she was criticised for not being a good enough homemaker for her future husband. From 12 and 16-year-old sisters in France who were trying to picnic in a public park when a man came and started masturbating in front of them. And a woman in India who was too afraid to report the man with the erection pressed into her back on the train. And because these stories were coming in so thick and fast and from such different places around the world, very quickly we built up this kind of grassroots database that was the first of its kind in terms of these testimonies of experiences of daily gender inequality. And what that means is that messages and themes and connections started to arise from the project entries in a really exciting way and in a way that felt quite new. And the first kind of connection that I want to tell you about that came out from the project entries was between the things that were considered minor or not such a big deal and between the more serious incidents, between issues like rape and sexual assault. So incredibly often, as we've seen this week, as a feminist or as a woman in the public eye, when you try to talk about certain issues, it's kind of accepted. You're allowed to talk about rape and domestic violence. They're considered serious problems. But very often, when you try to talk about street harassment, for example, you're told that you're making a fuss about nothing, there's more important things to worry about, you're getting your knickers in a twist. We're told that it's acceptable to worry about the underrepresentation of women in politics or in business. But when we try and talk about media sexism or things like page 3, we're told that we're overreacting, it's, we're being too draconian, it's free speech, that's not a big deal. And what was so clear from the project entries was that these things are connected. You can't possibly parcel them off into these convenient different boxes because that's not how our lives work. And because the ideas and attitudes towards women in one sphere have a knock-on impact in behaviour towards them in another. So the way that this was really clear from the entries in the project was that, for example, the same words and phrases that were used towards women who were being shouted at in the street, just street harassment, not a big deal, those same derogatory words or phrases for women were also used by an abuser behind closed doors who was beating his wife. We were told not to make a fuss about page 3, but we had women writing into us describing the fact that when they were raped, their rapist mentioned page 3 to them. Or we saw how when somebody tried to ignore what was apparently a minor incident, when they tried to brush off street harassment, for example, their harasser followed them home. It escalated because they became aggressive and abusive and they ended up sexually assaulting them on their doorstep because the idea that their right to that person's body in a public space had been rejected was so offensive to them. And so it became so clear that we have to take these things seriously, that it has to be acceptable to challenge this at every level, that it wouldn't make sense, for example, to say we have to take workplace sexism seriously if we let people walk down a street in which it's completely normal and accepted to shout at women, evaluate them, shout about their breasts. How can we expect somebody to walk down a street where that's the norm and then turn into an office building and suddenly actually now you have to think about women in this way, please? It just didn't make sense. In the same way, it wouldn't make sense to try and address the underrepresentation of women in politics if we don't also address the fact that when we do get women who are promoted to our cabinet, it's reported on as the catwalk of the Downing Street cuties. You know that clearly those things have a knock-on effect on one another. And that doesn't mean for a second suggesting that it's a simple case of cause and effect. No one is saying that looking at page 3 or looking at a lad's mag makes somebody go out and commit a sexual offence or a sexual assault. Of course it's more complex than that. But it is about saying that actually we're living in a country in which 85,000 women are raped every year and 400,000 sexually assaulted. We need to be able to have a conversation about the way that women are portrayed in our media. We need to have a conversation about the way that women are routinely spoken to at school or in the street. And we need to look at how the kind of ideas and attitudes towards women that kind of thing cultivate might be the fertile ground from which other things perhaps are more easily able to spring. We need to be able to consider these things without necessarily saying that one of them directly causes the other. It doesn't mean that we don't still need to talk about it. So that was the first connection that very clearly came out from the entries. The second connection was that it became very clear very early on that we were not just experiencing entries coming in from women who were experiencing sexism, we were also receiving entries that were from women who were definitely experiencing sexism, but it was combined with other forms of prejudice. So from really early on, for example, we were hearing from a disabled woman who was told to do a pole dance around her walking stick, or another who was waiting for her friend in her wheelchair and a man shouted at her in the street, "If you're just going to sit there, you might as well get your tits out." We heard from a black woman who was in a job interview when the interviewer started talking to her about his fantasies about sleeping with a spicy, exotic black woman. We heard from an Asian woman who was walking down the street with her university boyfriend when people shouted at him asking if she was a mail order bride. We heard from trans women who were physically hounded from public bathrooms, from women who were walking down the street with their female partners and had men following them, interrupting, interjecting, harassing them, saying, "Can I watch? Can I join in?" or "I've got something that can turn you straight." We heard from older women who again and again and again used the word invisible in their project entries. Every now and then there's a particular term or a particular phrase that echoes throughout the entries. In the case of 13 and 14-year-old girls, it's the phrase, "we can't win." And in the case of older women, it's the word invisible. We got one entry that came in from a woman in her 60s, and she said, "I'm 60, so I have too much to say in a small box. Here are some highlights arranged by decade." And at the end of her account, she said, "Haven't you ever noticed how many older women you see wearing bright coats in the street? It's because we're afraid that people will walk into us." And so I think what that showed and what became clear from that very early on was that in just the same way that you can't sort of conveniently compartmentalize the different types of sexism and gender inequality and sexual violence because they're interrelated, these different forms of prejudice also were interrelated. People weren't experiencing one of them on one day and then a different one separately on another day. They were experiencing them in a way that overlapped and in a cumulative way that made them worse, that they interfered with one another, and that therefore in tackling it we also had to look at tackling the problem in a way that was also intersectional. And I think for me the most helpful way of thinking about this that I found is that when I go into schools and I talk to really young children about sexism and gender inequality, I want to explain to them how incredibly ingrained it is, how incredibly normalised and structural it is. And the way that I try to help them to understand that is that if they're in a big assembly hall like this, I tell them all to close their eyes. You don't have to, but I tell them to close their eyes. And then I get them to imagine that they're at the dentist in the waiting room and that the door opens and they go in and they're sitting in the dentist chair and the big spotlight's on them and they can smell the minty smell and the green walls. And then I get them to imagine that the door opens and the dentist walks in. And then I tell them to keep their eyes closed, but to freeze that picture and to put their hand up if the dentist that they're imagining is a man. And then they look around and they realise just almost everybody in the room has their hand raised. And it's a way of just simply explaining that idea of what we think of as the default, what we think of as the norm, and how much of an impact that has on things that are so insidious and ingrained. And I think for me, the entries that we've had from women experiencing multiple forms of prejudice have made it so clear that it's not just a man that they're imagining. It's not just a man that is typically thought of as the default norm, it's also a white man, and it's a white, heterosexual, cisgendered, middle class, non-disabled man, and so on. And that just as one thing by deviating from the norm becomes othered and considered somehow lesser, actually there are common roots in that idea of being something that isn't seen as the default. And that what that meant was that, for example, if we were looking at issues of domestic violence, we weren't just talking about that statistic you saw earlier that 1 in 4 women experiences it, but that actually 1 in 2 disabled women does. Or that if we were looking at the gender pay gap and the fact that women earn 15% less than men on average for the same work in the UK today, that it's important also to look at the fact that actually women of colour are earning a lot less than white women. And so that was the second thing that came out very clearly from the project entries, that that approach needed to happen because that was the way people were experiencing these things in their lives. And then the third kind of connection that came out really clearly from the project entries was between the experiences that were being reported by women and the things that were coming in from men. So it became so clear incredibly early on that you could almost put entries side by side, and they demonstrated so perfectly that these were things that were having negative impacts on everybody. So for example, in the same week that we got that entry from the boy at school who was ridiculed and laughed at because he wanted to take drama and it was considered too girly, we also heard from a 12-year-old girl who was told that she wasn't allowed to play football at school. She couldn't join in because football was for boys. We heard from girls who'd been at school and been accused of being over-emotional or hysterical when they tried to make a firm point, and from boys who'd been bullied because they'd been caught crying and they were told that that was girly and that boys don't cry. We heard almost in the same week from a man who'd asked for parental leave because he wanted to spend time looking after his new baby, and in the office he'd not only been denied it but also had been really bullied and ridiculed for asking for it, and from two women who were business partners who'd applied for a promotion and had been told explicitly that they wouldn't get the promotion because they were considered a maternity risk, purely because of their age and sex, not because either of them had said that they'd had any plans to have any future children. So obviously, it wasn't men are dealing with these problems over here and women are dealing with these issues over here. Again, it was the same outdated gender stereotypes in the middle were having a negative impact on men and women. And it was certainly something that structurally was something that happened more frequently to women. It tended to be more severe for women, and the impact tended to be greater because of the structural context of gender inequality. But what we could see very clearly was that when men were experiencing these things, it was the fallout from two sides of the same coin. So what that meant really clearly from the beginning was that tackling this is in everybody's interests. And we know that from a macro and a micro level. So we know from these experiences that people are having bad experiences from two sides of the same coin. But at a macro level, we also know that companies with greater diversities on boards perform better. We know that countries where women are more empowered enjoy greater stability. And so very clearly what we realised was that this is something, again, that is in everybody's interest to tackle together. So it was never for 1 second about setting up men against women. It wasn't about vilifying men. It's never been about sort of a witch hunt or about saying that all men are bad. I think it's actually a tiny minority of men who are doing this. And it wasn't either about saying that all women were victims. It was about people standing up against prejudice rather than setting up men against women. And I think that's really important, because I think that perhaps there are stereotypes about feminism that have made people think that when we talk about feminism, what we mean is wanting women to rule the world, secretly hating men, having a kind of hidden agenda. And that's another thing that, you know, when I go into schools and I talk to young people, I ask them to put their hands up if they call themselves a feminist. And usually you get a kind of smattering of hands, maybe between sort of 15 and 20%. And then you say, okay, well, put your hand up if you think everyone should be treated equally regardless of their sexuality. And they all put their hands up, as they should. And then you say, well, put your hand up if you think everyone should be treated equally regardless of the colour of their skin, and they all put their hands up. And then you say, well, put your hand up if you think everyone should be treated equally regardless of their sex, and they all put their hands up. And then I just say to them, well, if you have your hand up now, you're a feminist, that's what it means. And you get the boys going, oh my God, it's like pulling their hands down, sure. But actually, I think there's been such a kind of smear campaign, a sense of a departure from that idea of what feminism means, and I feel really positive that we're coming back towards that kind of simple definition. I feel really positive that we know that 200 new feminist societies have been set up at schools and universities across the UK in the last couple of years alone. And I think it's really important to say this, because sometimes I think it's easy to get caught up in the idea of sexism and gender equality being something that manifests itself in terms of a single action from one person to another. And actually, in reality, not only is it not about saying that this is all about men being nasty to women, it's also worth saying that this is something structural. It's something that's bigger than us, it's bigger than individuals, it's in the world around us. And you can see that from the project entries that we get as well, that it is wider than individual issues. So it's things that people started picking up on and pointing out, the kind of thing that's in the world around us that you might not even notice because you go past it every day and it's so normal, and it's not until you put things side by side that you start to see what's going on. So, for example, looking at headlines from a major newspaper, all relatively kind of straightforward, detailing business people who are very highly qualified getting new appointments, but that somehow when you look at a very, very similar headline in the same newspaper, just shortly afterwards there's something slightly different going on there. And it's the kind of thing that sometimes you wouldn't even notice immediately. Sometimes it takes a minute to put your finger on just what the problem is. There's something not quite right, and often on more than one level, as in the case in this example. People were writing in as well about the way that the media made them feel, about the fact that they see women's bodies everywhere, that we are all so familiar with women's bodies. We know what women's bodies look like because we see them all around us every day. We're bombarded with them. But actually, we don't. We only know what one woman's body looks like. It's the same one body that we're seeing over and over again. We think we know what women look like because we see them everywhere, but it's actually very specifically one woman. We know what one very young, thin, very thin, large-breasted, long-legged, white, often long blonde-haired woman's body looks like. And I think one of the most surreal examples of this being the case was when the Duchess of Cambridge came out with her baby after giving birth. And there was absolute furore on Twitter and also on the national news of people scrambling to work out why she still had, quote, a baby bump. You had people on Twitter going, why is Kate still fat? Is the baby still in there? Is it twins? What's going on? There was a Sky News reporter who actually asked a midwife live on air, you know, why does she look like that? What's going on? And I think that was just this perfect moment where we realised that we know so much about women's bodies and what they look like, but actually only when it fits within that idea of the media and how the media wants women to look. And that widely, as a society, we had no idea that immediately after giving birth, that's what a woman's body looks like. And it was such an amazing moment because we think we are so familiar with women's bodies. And of course, people are also writing about the fact that it's not just that we see women's bodies, it's also that we see women's bodies in contexts where they're dehumanized. We see pieces of women's bodies being used out of context to sell products with the idea of something being commercial, the idea of something being consumable. Take this, here's a woman's body, this is something you want to take, this is something that's here for you. Advertising completely unrelated products from a burger to a betting website. But also about the fact that even if we were hearing about women for very specific reasons, if they were in the media not as a model but because of a particular news story, we were still seeing them through this lens of, are they attractive and do men want to have sex with them? These are several examples of women who'd been accused of crimes who, when it was being reported on in the media, as you can see, it was about how sexy they were. This is an actual phone-in about whether or not you would have sex with Amanda Knox. And that actually that was also true for women who were victims of crime, like Reva Steenkamp, seen here on the front page of The Sun the morning after she had been murdered. Or for politicians, as we've seen so very clearly just in the last few months during the election campaign. There was no way that I could get every example of the sexism that has faced Nicola Sturgeon in her campaign on a single slide. And it just isn't happening in the same way for men, for the male politicians. And it's funny because when you talk about this, people bring up examples, and they bring up specific examples of a cartoon that they've seen of Ed Miliband, or they mention that sometimes people talk about seeing David Gandy in his underwear on the front page of a magazine, or David Beckham on the side of a bus. And it's so interesting because the first thing to say is that, of course, this kind of thing happens to everybody, but if you look at the context, if you look at how often it happens and the way that it happens, yes, occasionally people make fun of Wayne Rooney's hair, that's an example that we get a lot, but not at the moment when he's lifting the championship trophy. Then all the focus is on his skill and on his game. Whereas actually for the winner of Wimbledon, in the final match when she was winning Wimbledon, the commentator was talking about her looks and whether or not she was beautiful. And it's the same kind of thing here, I think, in the heat of an election campaign when we're hearing mostly about Miliband's policies and his ideas for the country. This is how Nicola Sturgeon is being portrayed. And yes, David Beckham and David Gandy are in their pants, but they are both selling pants. That is what those images are doing. And there is a difference in terms of the context. And another kind of interesting thing that started coming in quite quickly after I started the project was these kinds of reactions that really took me by surprise. This is what happened the first time that I went on the kind of mainstream radio show to discuss the project and to discuss sexism. This is what happened the first time I gave a speech about politics. And these kinds of messages started coming in really quite early on, before the project had really had very many entries, before it really had any kind of international attention, before there was much press attention at all. they were coming in sometimes at the rate of up to 200 a day. And the first morning that I woke up and found these 200 messages in my inbox, it was really early on, and I was desperately trying to promote and publicise the project. So before I went to bed, Lady Gaga was holding a Twitter chat about bullying. And I sent Lady Gaga a tweet about the project saying, you know, sometimes bullying can be gendered, and have a look at this new project. And I went to bed and I actually said to my boyfriend before we went to sleep, just imagine, maybe Lady Gaga will retweet that, and maybe tomorrow everyone will be talking about the project and there'll be hundreds of entries. And we woke up the next morning and I looked at my phone and I went, oh my God, we've got 200 entries, it must be Gaga, she must have tweeted it. And what actually happened was that I read the first one, and it was somebody describing very, very explicitly exactly which kind of knives they would use and in what order when they murdered me. And that was just such an incredible shock. It was in 2012, so it was before this stuff had hit the headlines, it was before it had all been in the news. And I think it's important to talk about it because really what it shows, ironically, is how important this kind of project is. Really what it shows is how threatening it is and how scary it is to some people just to talk about these things, just to provide a platform, just to share experiences, just to challenge the status quo. That for some people that is so threatening that the only way that they can think of to respond is in this kind of violent manner. And it's also kind of ironic because of course it undermines itself. So reacting to a project that is about sexism by saying stop doing your project because there's no such thing as sexism, you stupid bitch, is kind of ironically undermining your own argument. But I think it's important to talk about because I think this is something that a lot of people are experiencing online, and particularly a lot of young women. And at the moment I think we are looking at a phase of time where people aren't necessarily politically active in the way that they used to be, that people are using online world as a means of getting involved in political debates, that sometimes people are having arguments on their Facebook wall or on Tumblr, and that's where they're learning about setting out your argument and about talking to other people about your point of view and about how to debate and how to defend yourself. And that actually we know now there are 200 million fewer women online than there are men, and that increasingly young women are being driven out of those public spaces, those online spaces, because it is such a hostile environment, because it is so unsafe for them. And I think that's really important because I think we risk losing a generation of young people from those very, very important conversations, both on and offline, if they get the message, this isn't for you, this isn't safe for you. But it isn't all bad news, because what the unexpected kind of growth of the project has meant is that we've been able to start using what started out as an awareness-raising platform to create kind of concrete change offline. So we've been able to start taking the project entries into the real world and basically just linking them up thematically with the people who have the power to do things about them. So for example, we're able to use them a lot with politicians when they're looking at specific areas. So when Nick Clegg was looking at ways to tackle the gender pay gap, I was able to go to meet with him and to say, this is what women are saying, this is 1,000 women's experiences, this is what they're dealing with in the workplace right now, these are some of the problems on the ground. Or when Ed Miliband was thinking about what to do about sex and relationships policy, it was possible to go in and say, actually, here are 1,000 entries, this is what schoolgirls are dealing with in the classroom. And I think that one was particularly important because there is so much going on that young people are dealing with, and particularly stuff that's happening online that's having an impact on them. So you often hear, we have emails from 13-year-old girls that say things like, my name is Nicola, I'm 13 years old, and I'm so scared to have sex that I cry nearly every night because a boy at school showed me a video on his mobile phone, and I didn't realise until I saw it that when you have sex, the woman has to be crying and hurting. And a few weeks after we received that, I was in a school where they'd experienced a rape case, and it was involving a 14-year-old boy perpetrator. And one of the teachers told me that a teacher had said to him, why didn't you stop when she was crying? And that he had looked straight back at her and said, because it's normal for girls to cry during sex. And these are not isolated incidents. We heard from a 17-year-old girl who'd had sex for the first time with her boyfriend, and she said in the middle of it, he suddenly started trying to throttle her. So she pushed him off and sort of burst into tears, and she said that he broke down in relief and said, is that not what you were expecting? And I think that this isn't necessarily about what you believe or where you stand on porn, whether or not you think it's inherently harmful as a medium. I think what we probably can agree on is that a lot of the porn that is online, that is very readily accessible right now, does show things which are about women being hurt, being degraded, being humiliated, and that it's so incredibly easily accessible that the BBC reckons 60% of 14-year-olds have accessed it. So I think what that means is if we know that they're seeing it and we know it's having this kind of impact, we have to give them the tools to deal with it. We can't realistically try and stop young people from seeing porn, I don't think, but we could so easily talk to them in school about healthy relationships, about sexual consent, about their rights to their own body. And at the moment, there is absolutely no guarantee on the curriculum that kids will learn anything except for the biology of sex. There's no current guarantee that they will learn anything about those incredibly simple things. Nobody has the right to touch you without your consent. And we hear from 14 and 15 and 16-year-old girls who say that it's normal for somebody to grope them, to touch them on the tube in their school uniform on the way to school. And very often they say things like, I've been taught to be polite, so I didn't think that I should say anything, or I didn't think I should bother anybody else, or I've been taught to be polite, so I thought that I should answer him when he started talking to me. And we've taught them these things. We've taught 14-year-old girls to be polite. We've taught them not to bother anybody. But no one's ever taught them, no one has the right to touch you without your consent. And it's so incredibly simple. So it's that kind of message that you're able to then go in and use these project entries to deliver to politicians, to say, actually, look, this is what young people are experiencing in their own words, and that's why we need this kind of thing. We were able to take about 2,000 of our entries that just came from women on buses and tubes, on public transport, to the British Transport Police when they'd realised that they'd done a survey and they found that a huge number of women were experiencing harassment and assault on public transport, but that only 5% of them were reporting it. So they came to us and we were able to join up because they didn't have the stories, but we did. They had the power to deal with it, but we didn't. And so we broke the stories down into categories. It wasn't just about harassment. It was about women being followed home from the bus stop. It was about a man taking a photo underneath your skirt up the escalator at the tube. It was about men masturbating next to you on the bus. It was about people being cornered on tubes and groped and touched. And we broke it down into those categories, but also essentially looked at the reasons women had said why they didn't report. I didn't think I would be believed. I didn't think it would be taken seriously. I didn't think it was a big enough deal to go to the police over. And they used that to retrain 2,000 British Transport Police, TfL and frontline workers, specifically around a kind of victim-centred approach of supporting and believing the victim. And then we used our social media reach to go back to women and say, actually, you can report this. We've spoken to the BTP. They will take it seriously. And that particular initiative raised the reporting of sexual offences on public transport by 30% and also the detection of offenders. So it is good news. There are good, really positive, strong things coming out of this, and we're also able to use the project entries that come from young people to go and start conversations in schools about healthy relationships and about sexual consent, to go and work in universities with teenagers, with young people, and to take the project offline into communities in ways that are hopefully helpful in starting conversations about these things. But the other thing that's incredibly exciting is that since the project hit, I would say about 50,000 entries, we started hearing a different kind of entry coming in. And we are still absolutely hearing from people who are experiencing harassment and abuse and discrimination, but we're also hearing a different kind of story. We're hearing from people like the single mum who said that she knew it was a small thing, but she was sick of cold callers ringing and asking to speak to the man of the house. So now she puts them on to her 6-year-old son. And he sings them, "I'm sexy and I know it." Or we heard from a woman who said that she was an engineer and she was sick of other people in the office asking her to do their photocopying for them just because she was a woman. It was the only woman in the building, even though they knew she was an engineer. So after she repeatedly brought this up and was ignored, she just started coming into work 10 minutes early and breaking the printer. We heard from a man who said that he'd been reading the project entries and reading how it made women feel when they experienced street harassment, and later walking along the street saw 2 men shouting at 2 women in front of him saying, "Get your tits out." So he just lifted up his shirt and showed them his instead. We heard from a woman who said that she was a keen runner and would often be harassed when she was out running. And she said that she had been reading the project website and seeing all these other women standing up and saying what had happened to them. And that very soon afterwards she went for a run and a guy called her over from his car and asked for directions. So she went over and helped him out, and he then leaned out of his car window and grabbed her breast really hard, really hurt her. And she said, "I felt all of the the emotions crash over me that I would usually feel in that situation: embarrassment and shame and anger and the urge to run. But I also felt something I'd never felt before, and it was the fact that so many other people were behind me, would stand up next to me, and it just gave me the strength for a moment to stop and take down the car number plate, and the guy's been charged with assault. And so people started sending in these stories about the ways that they had found in their own lives, in their own very individual ways, to stand up. There was a woman who said that she was often walking down the street and that guys would point out to her that she had big breasts. They would shout things at her like big tits or big boobs. So she started looking down at them and screaming like she'd never seen them before. We heard from a woman in the office who was often told by a male colleague when she disagreed with him about something, he'd kind of turn to the others in the office and say, "Don't mind her, everybody, she's just on her period." So when this became really grating, eventually she just turned around to him one day and said, "If I had to bleed to find you annoying, I'd be anemic." And it stopped happening. And I think that that's kind of the frustrating and the exciting thing about where we are now, that in many of these cases the legislation is in place but it isn't having effect on the ground. The perfect example of this, I think, is the workplace. There is really good workplace sexual harassment legislation, but the single biggest category of entries that we get at Everyday Sexism is from women in the workplace, which is quite shocking when you think about how prevalent street harassment is. And so what we're clearly seeing is that it isn't trickling down to have the on-the-ground effect. There is that sense, it's just banter, it's just normal, I kind of had to put up with it. I don't want to rock the boat, I don't want to be seen as a troublemaker or making a fuss. And what that means is that what we really need now more than anything else is a shift in our normalised, accepted social attitudes towards women and behaviours towards women. It really is that thing about the standard you walk past being the standard that you accept. And in a way that's frustrating and scary because it would be so easy if there was a simple goal that we could all point to. But on the other hand, it's also incredibly exciting because it means that this is something that we could change tomorrow if we wanted to. But I think it's a lot like climate change. Bear with me. Because, firstly, people who aren't directly affected by it are so keen often to say, "I don't really believe it, I don't think it's happening, doesn't affect me, so I don't think it's there." But also in terms of the fact that if only 10% of us fastidiously recycle everything, separate out our cardboard and our plastic and our glass, it won't have the same effect overall as everybody needs to do it together. And the same is really true here. I know it sounds a bit cheesy, but it is one of those things that what is considered normal shifts when enough of us stand up to it. And it can be something incredibly minor because this will cross each of our paths at some point. It doesn't have to mean waving a banner or going on a march if that's not what's right for you. It can mean being the person that stands up in the office when someone's dismissed as a maternity risk, or just being the person that objects to a rape joke, or being the person that steps in and says to his mate that it's not okay to address a girl as a slag or a whore, or being somebody that supports a victim of street harassment to realise that she can report it if she wants to, or really being the person on that bus that when you have that moment you have the choice to look out of the window or to stand up, and being the person that stands up. Because not only would it have taken away that feeling of shame and embarrassment and humiliation from me, but I really think it would have made that guy think twice about doing the same thing to somebody else in the future. And the thing about standing up is that it's incredibly scary to do it on your own, because this is essentially bullying. So much of this boils down to bullying. And bullying revolves around a power structure whereby the person who objects is isolated. It's as simple as that. What that means is that it's so hard to stand up against this, especially if you're the victim, but that actually if 2 or 3 or a few people stand up to it, then that kind of power really dissolves and it falls away. And I think what that means is that often we're best placed to challenge it when we're not the one person experiencing it. We're often best placed to challenge it when we're seeing it happen to other people. If you're in a workplace where it's terrifying to be seen as a troublemaker or rocking the boat and you're worried about your career, all of those risks fall away if a team of 5 women stand up and say together, we have a problem and we need to challenge this atmosphere or whatever it is. And I think the same is true on campus as well. So I really think that to make that change, it involves picking up on it when it crosses each of our paths, but also supporting other people when they're dealing with it as well. And I want to leave you with an example of that and how successfully that can work, and to show you that other people will jump in and back you up, other people will have your back. This is what happened on Twitter. It's only a small thing, but I think it illustrates the point. When a sport-related Twitter account sent out this tweet ahead of a big match, asking women to send pictures of their tits. And what happened was that one brave person decided to challenge them by sending them this. And she wasn't left out there on her own, because very quickly someone sent them a pair of jugs. And somebody else joined in and sent them some nice baps. Then they were the recipient of a massive rack. Someone else sent a lovely muff. They also received a huge pair of bazookas and even a cute little lass. Thank you.